Bueno, buen día. Les voy a contar un poco acerca de lo que tenemos en la versión 16.
Hello, I'm going to tell you a bit of what we have in version 16 in order to create a chatbot. Chatbots are basically a kind of conversational user interface. The user interacts directly with the robot, and it's based on platforms for the processing of natural language. Here you see some of them: Western Assistant, Flow, Recast, that of Microsoft, and now we are working with Watson Assistants, and we are working to support others. And the chatbot generator allows us to create a solution, as I said, for Watson Assistants, but it can support any kind of solution for the processing of natural language. That is why, as we'll see, it will hide the complexity behind. And we are going to build a model to do a chatbot, and we're going to generate the object and have our chatbot in any of these platforms. Besides, it's a solution integrated in GeneXus. We will be able to have hybrid solutions too. That is to say, not only chatbots that interact by text, but also we will be able to return panels and objects with graphic interface, both for consultation and for data. For example, in the website of a university, we will allow students to consult the exams results, the subject matters, and also register for an exam by completing a form. I'll tell you firstly about the architecture of this solution. We have three components: the user interface, the server where the objects are processed, and the solutions in NLP, the platform I was telling you about. So from the UI, we have the chatbot. The user enters a message. That message is processed in the server. The necessary package is put up depending on the NLP solution we are using. We don't have to worry about that because the objects are generated automatically. Then the request that travels to the solution in LLP, and this is where the user's query is processed. The response is decided. It's sent to the server again, which decides what response the user is going to receive, and it's sent. It can be a text or a graphic response, like a web panel or other kind of panel. How do we work with the chatbot generation in version 16 or in the following versions? We create a new object that we have in GeneXus, which is called conversational flow. We create this object and we can start designing our chatbot and model. I wanted to explain that this has a function which is similar to the mechanism of a pattern, in the sense that we are going to apply the pattern, generate the object, and the mechanism is very similar. Objects are generated inside our knowledge base like the pattern was with, but it's also possible to generate components from the side of the NLP solution. It functions like with the mechanism or with something similar to the mechanisms of a pattern. We are going to have the pattern settings, but they will be specific for this case, the chatbot generation. In the pattern setting, you will be able to configure things that are generic to all of the instances, which are the conversational flows I told you about. So, as I was saying, what is going to be generated is on the side of GeneXus the objects that are necessary for the dialogue with the chatbot, and on the side of the provider, as you see, a dialogue. This capture it from Watson Assistants, but it can be supported by others too. So for the provider, there will be a dialogue with all the intents and the entities, and I won't have to be concerned about doing it. On the side of GeneXus, the objects are going to be created with the whole logic to interact with this dialogue that has been created from on the side of the provider. What are the objects that we are going to have in the knowledge base when we apply the chatbot generator in these instances, in this conversational flow? Firstly, we have the resources. These are like examples. They are examples that allow us to continue to start working and have our chatbot defined for web or smart devices. The resources are in a module that is called Common Chatbots. The objects of this module, these resources, are updated in each build. If you want to update them, you can do them with a property that we have in the pattern setting, which is called keep resources updated. You can say that you want to update the resources or you do not want to update them after you have imported them, or it may ask you in every case, why would I want not to import them again? Because it's possible that these resources have already been modified and I don't want anything to override them. The most important thing is, or the most recommended, is to do a save as of these resources and continue working in parallel with my objects, and that these objects are updated if there is an improvement or a build. Am I going too fast, or do you understand? So I'm going to tell you about some of the resources. A couple of important resources are these tables that are created in the database of your application, the GX chat method and the GX chat user. The first one contains the message, the metadata, the reference to the user, the necessary information that has to do with the conversation, the chat. And GX chat user contains the user and the device name. The panel chat SD, which is one of the resources that we have to represent the chatbot in SD, is offline, so the tables remain in the device. This so that the user can see the conversation if it's offline. In the Carmine SD, you are going to be classes that give style or aesthetics to the resources. That is to say, the web panel and the SD panel, which are examples of chatbots. And these are the objects I was telling you about. This is a capture of the web panel, which is an example, and you will see it in the practical exercises. It's a screen that shows the message and the components inside a grid that allow us to show graphic components in the conversation. So these are the resources, and the resources can be edited or changed if you wish. Then the generated objects. These are objects that are generated every time you generate an instance. And I shouldn't change them because I'm going to lose the changes. I have the generated objects in a module that has the name of my instance, my chatbot, my conversational flow. In particular, there's a couple of objects that have the name of the instance followed by WebUI or SDUI or WebUI, and look at the name of the panel. This is the model of the resources, and the object is called, and we have as parameters the provider and the name of the instance. And I say this because maybe you will want to call this object or resource by another mean. For example, as if it were a component, you have to take into account with which parameters you are calling it. And we talk about resources and generated objects. Another one of the components that is incorporated in your KB is an external module that contains everything that is related to interaction with objects, the logic that allows you to talk with a chatbot, but there are some interesting methods, and I want to tell you about this. Send entity values. This method is interesting if in the provider you want to update the entities. Let's look at what an entity is. Basically, it's additional information that allows the provider to identify the intention of the user. It's groups of values with synonyms, and this information is inside the provider. So by this method, we can send to the provider values and synonyms of a certain entity. So how do we create a chatbot using GeneXus? I mentioned as concepts, entities, intentions, and other contexts. And now I'm going to tell you what I mean by each one of them. The intent is the goal of the user when it makes a consultation. For example, I want to find out about outdoor activities in the city. That is the intent. The entity is additional information that allows us or allows the provider to identify the intention of the user. It gives extra information to identify this intention. In this case, it wants to find information about activities, but they have to be outdoor activities. So the entity is a group of values, and each value can have n synonyms. In this case, it can be the type of activity: cultural, artistic, educational. And each one of these values will have a synonym, and this is information that is in the provider. And another concept is the context. Every conversation has a context. When I'm talking to a person, 1 minute after you started, we both know what we are talking about. We've understood what we are talking about, and this happens with a robot. The robot cannot ask n times the same thing to the user, and in this case it can be a city. If it's clear which city we are talking about, the bot is not going to ask which city they are talking about. With this concept, we can create a chatbot. What we have to do firstly is to ask ourselves what are the intents that the chatbot is going to cover. For example, a citizen service chatbot could cover the following: do a traffic claim, find out about activities, or refinancing a debt, or get your driving license, etc. What's important is that these intents are going to be interpreted by the provider with a certain level of confidence. So I'm going to show you a video that you're going to see later on during the exercise. What is the level of confidence? This is machine learning. It's a processing of natural language. So to a certain extent, it interprets things, but it's not mathematical. It interprets the user's query with a certain level of confidence. That means the higher the level of confidence is, the more likely that it will be able to say the intent of the user is such and such. Artistical activities, it's not pure maths. It's processing of natural language. So in this case, we say hello in the chatbot, and the first thing that the chatbot says is, I know how to reply about 3 things: a question that you make, accepting a claim, or setting up an appointment. It can therefore talk about a limited quantity of things, and it's good to clarify and tell the user what the chatbot can talk about. the user says, I want to make a consultation, and the bot says, well, I can reply with regard to activities and administrative proceedings. This is an entity. Activities and administrative proceedings are two values of an entity, and that's what with what you can find in the provider with their synonyms. For example, the user says, well, I want to talk about activities, and the important thing is that it gives us values or some synonyms of these values so that we understand each other and we know what it's talking about. Now the user says, well, about activities, thanks. And from there, the value in the provider is inferred. And it's inferred that the user wants to ask about activities. Then the bot asks, fine, activities, but what kind of activities? Cultural, artistic, or natural? In nature. So this is another entity with three values, and each one has its synonyms. The user can put one of the synonyms, and it's interpreted, it is understood. And then we'll see how the entities are defined in the provider. Once the intent has been understood with a sufficient level of confidence, then the responses to this intent are given back to the user. It's a panel, and there we find all of the activities. So far, the intent, and here the user can select one of the activities. For example, he selects a botanical garden, and the bot interprets, because that's how it's modeled, that the user wants to make a guided visit and asks, when would you like to go? And the user says tomorrow, 5 p.m. And that's fine. The appointment is made. In this case, we recorded data. In the other case, it was a consultation. So how do we do all this? We have a new object in GeneXus, which is called conversational flows, which represents our bot, our chatbot. It looks like a tree, and each one of the flows is an intent in the provider. In the case of citizen services, there will be a flow for greetings, another one to do a claim, another one to a problem with sewage, the other one to get activities, outdoor activities information. All are flows inside my chat, and this is a representation of my conversational flow. The important thing is that when I generate this object, these intents are created automatically in the provider. Now, coming back to your question, I have to help the provider to understand the intent, because there's 1,000 ways of asking about activities in the city. Well, maybe not 1,000 ways, but at least quite a few. So I have to train the provider so that it can correctly identify the intents I have defined. And this I do through the property trigger messages. Through the flow node, I have this property to trigger messages, and there I'm going to put the various ways in which a user can ask the question about obtaining information. Know about activities, find out about leisure, social events information. This information is taken from logs, and it's not that I, as a developer, can think of all the ways of asking. There's a pilot project based on logs, and we learn the ways in which a user tried to ask something and failed. So it's a process of training, and as any machine learning process. But we cannot be exhaustive, because everything that is semantically equivalent to these questions will bring in the same results, because all this is based in natural language. When you say that it's learning, those questions means that I have to generate again a KB, or can I do it online? Can I add it? Well, today we are working exclusively from GeneXus, but when we add trigger message, all you have to do is save. You remember that we are working in GeneXus. When you save the instance, you have a JSON with what I'm adding. It travels to the provider, Watson, etc. And at the level of the intent, it adds this example. They are called examples in Watson Assistant. Today, it is unidirectional from the KB to the provider. This is a way of adding. What if you have to eliminate because it's inferring something that is incorrect? Yes, I can delete it. The important thing is that it's not bidirectional, it's unidirectional at the moment. We are seeing how to improve it for the future, but the changes that you have in your model impact it. I repeat, if you change these trigger messages, what you save is what is in the instance. So what is defined in GeneXus is mandatory. The only thing that is not synchronized is the values that you have defined in the entities. But if you eliminate a trigger message from a flow, that text will not remain as an example of that intent in the provider. I don't know whether I've been clear enough. I tried this and I saw that GeneXus is always generating the object in English, and the provider can support other languages, but I didn't find out how to change it. That by default we are generating it in English, but we have to add the property so that the language can be defined. It's something we're going to fix. We are going to add other languages. It won't be always in English. So when the user said he wanted to do some activities, remember the bot replied, well, I can tell you about art, culture, or outdoor activities. We said that this is an entity that we already have in Assistance or Dialogflow or the provider or whichever provider it is, and this is created automatically, the entities with their values and synonyms. And through this method, set entity values, I can load the values of these entities in the provider. Now, if we continue with the flow, how did I ask the user what he really wanted? Well, we have a user input in our flow. We have a property, ask messages. In this property, we tell the user what's the question we're going to ask so that he replies. So the bot is going to ask the question so that the user replies. And this user input has the property of match with entity with the value true. So what the user says, we are going to extract the value of an entity. Which one? This one, that is the one that is specified in property entity. If the user does not enter anything that has to do with this entity, then this we can handle through the property try limit. It's the number of things that I'm going to tell the user. Well, I didn't understand that. I can reply about art or culture or nature. The try limit is 2. And in error message, I have a message that says, I don't know about X thing. Sorry, please enter culture, art, or nature. I don't know whether you can see that here it says username and the variable as if it were a variable. This is because username is in the context. At some point, I talk to the user and I know how it's called, so I tell the name of the person, and I said, I can't understand, I can't reply about user input. The user says, I want to do activities with the bike, and I said, I don't understand. I said, Pedro, I don't know about bicycle activities. Why? Because it's not among the values of the entity. Is that clear? So, when the value is instantiated, when the value of the entity is understood, it becomes an instance in this variable. And then I have to filter, I have to execute an object that gives me the activities that are available according to this filter. And this is something that is saved for me later as a designer of this model. When we look at the error message, we see that not only one message can be generated, but also a list of messages. In that case, how does it reply to one or the other? How is an error message chosen? What it will do, in fact, is give you the message randomly. It's not one after the other. It just takes one from the collection of messages. It's not always the same in one time. The messages can be different and it sounds a little bit more intelligent. We don't want it to look like a robot. So, as I was saying, what will happen with the response? I know what the user wants. I'm going to look for a response, and I'm going to execute, well, actually it's done automatically, an object that is indicated in the property conversational object. In this case, we have a data provider which is going to receive as parameters the type of activity that the user wants to enjoy, and I'm going to look for all of the activities under that value. Now, when we assign the property conversational object, automatically in my flow it is inferred that or the inputs and the outputs of that data provider are inferred. So originally I had a flow like this one. I assign the property conversational object with a data provider. The data provider receives as parameters the type of activity, and the output is a collection. So automatically in the flow it is inferred the input and the output. Why? Because I have the possibility of having automatically generated an object with that information that will be used for the response. A component will be generated, in this case an SD panel, with that information, the information that is in my model. Basically, this object will call my data provider. And what does it have on the screen? Well, it has the output parameters of the data provider, which is a grid because it's a collection, and it shows all the activities that are available filtered according to what the user wants to do. I am not obliged to use the panel generated automatically. I can use a panel created by me. So once I have created my model, what do? Well, we save the instance, and my model is impacted in the provider, but you can also force the impact with the option synchronize chatbot. Right click on the instance and the model is impacted on the provider. We have the option generate chatbot, which also happens in the build if necessary, and it generates all the objects in MiKB. All the objects I talked about are generated in the KB, and then it's possible, for example, to make an appointment for a guided visit, and it's important to bring it for two reasons. Firstly, It is not necessary to request the activity to the user, because we have already talked about this activity. So when the appointment is made, well, it looks like a conversation. We know what we are talking about. And then the another user input is the date. When we ask the user, when do you want to schedule it? He said, tomorrow at 5 p.m. And all this can be interpreted because it's defined as an entity of the system inside the provider. And it's a provider that interprets that expression, whereas tomorrow, today, not in the afternoon, but the dates or anything that can refer to a date. And the conversational object is a procedure. It can be any kind of GeneXus object. The flows solve the intention, but it may happen that the flow in itself does not solve it, and it's necessary to redirect to another flow. Let's say that we want to make a claim, and it's necessary to get more information from the user. For example, claim type sanitation. We ask, where's the problem?
In that case, what you do, well, in the claim, you have user input with a condition, and you say, well, if the type of claim is sanitation or sewage, I will redirect it to something I call green place claim, and I would ask for the pertinent claim ID, where the problem took place, and so on. Now, it is important that the user can go directly through here. He can say, well, instead of making a claim, I would like to do it for a sewage problem. And in that case, it would be sanitation. They're not nestled there, right? And this is the case, saying I'm so and so. I'd like to make to do a claim about sanitation problem. It would go through it, but look here, there is something important. The user has already said who he was, and so to look for to make believe that this is a human interaction, I can't ask his name again. So there is a match entity where I've got all users registered. I already know who he is. I'm not going to ask for the ID of this user. It's already matched. And don't clean the context. Keep the user ID, because perhaps the user makes another claim, and I'm not going to ask for it again. So we don't have much time left, but let's see what the context is. Well, the context is managed through user inputs. They can all be in the context, so as not to ask for it again. And this is done through the property called clean context value. If I don't clean it, I keep that value in my session. And then we have the context GX user input. It's interesting that I repeat what he says so that the conversation seems more human. Now, in GeneXus, you have a try live, and this is to change and see how the provider answers. So we would ask the question. He's not going to answer objects. It's not executing SD or web objects, but it is on this side. It is giving the provider's answer, and we've got some more context about what's happening. This is very useful. Well, is there a way of setting the context before starting? In case you have it in an app, you know who he is, and well, yes, we can record the context, but we haven't got it built in. Well, we can do it by hand. We can add methods to the API to change it. And so the question of language, and this is something that in the app, well, it's fully trained in English, and at random, answers. So we put into English all this language, all the messages, so we have more certainty when answering, and then we translate back. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, when you add a new example, apart from the case you synchronize save, something we want to add to this API is that in runtime, we can add these examples. So you can have your own panel, and you're saying, well, this goes to this other intention, and so on and so forth. Let's suppose I'm making a chatbot for a supermarket, and I define an entity called products, and I have thousands of products. Is it reasonable to do that? Because, when you have a lot of volume of data, have you tested it? And up to how many entities would a chatbot support? Well, that's a quite complicated question. It doesn't seem to be the best practice to put in 1,000, 2,000 entities. It was a question of training. You would have to see which the best way to solve this is in each model. I've been asked for more extreme cases. If I've got 1 million users, what shall I do? Well, perhaps use other types of parameters. As regards products, you'll have to have 10 products that are called practically the same, and so there's going to be confusion. You'll have to see the case. Are you thinking about taking away the chatbot editor? For instance, the themes and the question of translations? If we are thinking about taking the chatbot out from GeneXus, well, no, not for the time being. Another question: among the providers, is there anyone that you would recommend with more functionalities? I could see in the documents that it would say only valid for Watson. Well, no, it's Watson Assistant Dialogue Phone, and that's it. We have no preference. Isn't that there are more functionalities in one or the other? Well, in some particular cases, it would be, conditioning the flows, but you can solve it by using dialog flow. You'll always end up by choosing according to your environment. If you're working with IBM, you would use Watson Assistants, and what you have to do is to try it out and see which one was best. One of the things that this allows you to do is that you change a property with dialog flow, and then with Watson Assistant, you don't have to touch anything, change anything, and then you can choose the best one for your case. When you want to make a human in the middle process, how do you go about it? When the chat talks with someone, it goes back to channeling the conversation. Could that be done? Well, we have to do it manually at present, but in the case of there are many mistakes being made, or the intention is to talk with someone, well, I don't know, you would put a control there and say, well, don't send any more messages, and we would follow a chat. And according to what Maxi mentioned, well, you could be refreshing messages. We would have to see how this is done.